With the first portrait of, I discussed a person who was a pioneer in the care of transgender people, Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld. And for this second episode of this occasional series, we will meet someone who was also a pioneer, this time for trans rights, and like Dr. Magnus, is someone we have met before. I will use contemporary language and terminology throughout, although I will highlight and use some outdated terminology to illustrate how understanding of being trans has evolved. Also, on the transcript page for this episode on the podcast website at www.twts.co.uk are links to 3 videos that I mention. And if you enjoy listening to this episode, the previous 20 episodes may be of interest, and perhaps you could let family, friends, colleagues who you think might be interested know about the podcast. Also, we have been downloaded in 61 countries in every continent bar Antarctica. Anyone planning a trip to Antarctica? Perhaps you could make it all 7 continents. Welcome to Transwise Transstrong. I am Caroline O'Reilly. Episode 21, Portrait of Caroline Cossey. One can be getting on with one's life when out of the blue the world can come crashing in like a vile, unwanted visitor. The visitor in this case was a newspaper that no longer exists, the British News of the World. The reason for its demise on the 10th of July 2011 was as a result of the phone hacking scandal, where it, along with a number of other tabloid newspapers, discovered that many people had not changed their phone's default PIN used to access voicemail. And instead of highlighting this risk to privacy, they exploited it, committing criminal offences by illegally intercepting mobile phone voicemails of the famous and not so famous, as well as children's voicemails. This disgusting behaviour was not atypical of the paper, as 20 years earlier, on the 6th of September 1981, the News of the World, with transphobic cruelty, intruded into Caroline's life by revealing that they were assigned male at birth, and their phrasing was equally cruel. Yet, 3.5 years earlier, on the 9th of April 1978, another Murdoch publication, The Sun, was happy to feature Caroline with her sister posing topless on their infamous page 3. And that delightful bit of sexism finally bit the dust on the 20th of January 2015. But where did Caroline's story begin? It was on the 31st of August 1954 that Caroline was born in Norwich, and it was whilst at junior school that Caroline experienced balance issues and was examined at a hospital where they suggested, somewhat vaguely, it might be something hormonal. Later, Caroline would reflect that this was the first indication of her physiological differences, not that the hospital picked up on this then. After junior school, senior school followed, which Caroline left aged 15, as it wasn't until 1972 that the leaving age in the UK was raised to 16. As her build was slight, she was bullied, but this was also when she would dress up at home with her sister Pam and try on makeup. It was during her last year at school that Caroline grew her hair long, which was not then unusual, if male, but she was teased about her long hair, although was less worried by this teasing. Following school, she began working at a boutique, then transferred to a smaller branch close to a gay pub, which she eventually plucked up the courage to go in, and met someone with whom she would have her first relationship, Adrian. Caroline would wear makeup when going out, as she liked looking like a girl, and gradually began wearing more makeup. And after a while, they were invited to a party held in a large house with extensive grounds, and got to know and became great friends with the host, Neville. However, after a scary hitchhiking experience, Caroline decided to move to London, where she lived first in a small flat, then moved into a bedsit with someone she met at the party, David. In London, she found work in a delicatessen, but also worked evenings in theatres to boost her income as a member of the front of house staff. The bedsit was in a large house, and there she met someone who would play a pivotal role in her life, Polly, who Caroline first thought was a cisgender woman, but she was actually a drag artist. They would go out to clubs that had drag cabarets, and at one Caroline had another scary experience when she and Polly narrowly escaped a possible arrest for female impersonation. This was the early 70s, and in the UK, trans women had no legal recognition of their gender identity, hence, when in public, could be charged with female impersonation or a public order offence. I was going to say this seems hard to credit now, and yet, as of April 2025, the Supreme Court ruled that a person could be excluded from places, facilities, organisations if their gender identity was not the same as the sex they were assigned at birth. Although the ruling applied equally if trans male, I've yet to hear of any instances of trans male exclusion. Funny that. On a personal level, I suppose I could be threatened with arrest if I use a toilet in line with my gender, which I have done without issue for over the last 6 years. Well, if that happens, my response would be bring it on, because I'm prepared to stand up and be counted. Reminds me of a song lyric. Caroline was spending her evenings dressing more feminine and enjoyed buying makeup. Then, one night, her friend Polly gave a party, which was a turning point for Caroline, where the usual drag queens were invited. However, one caught her attention, as she had breasts. And when, a few days later, she came out with Caroline and Polly, Caroline asked her about her breast development and was told she was taking hormone tablets and gave her the details of the doctor who prescribed them. Caroline made an appointment, and at the appointment she said she was 20 to appear more mature when she was actually 17 and was given a prescription for hormone tablets. Her doctor also told her she could have gender affirming surgery, which is also known as genital reconstruction surgery or bottom surgery. However, this would have been described as a sex change operation, a phrase I hate, and Caroline knew this was the path she would have to take. Initially, Caroline thought that Casablanca was the place to go for her operation, although subsequently learnt that although it was a great place as a film setting, it was not so great for gender affirming surgery. So why my animus to that phrase? Well, I contend that my sex was almost female. Yes, my physiology wasn't until I began gender affirming hormone therapy and had my gender affirming surgery. Therefore, my surgery did not change my sex. What it achieved was to align my body to my gender, and not just aesthetically, but following full recovery. Well, all I will just say is, wow! Before starting her hormone therapy, Caroline had been going home regularly. Then her brother, Terry, came to stay with her for a little while, and Caroline decided to let him see her as she was now. He thought she looked amazing and said he would let her parents know about her transition. However, a fraught call with her father resulted in a period when she broke off contact. However, her sister Pam helped her re-establish her relationship with her parents. It was whilst working at her theatre job that she was invited for an audition to become a showgirl and was successful, although because of her skimpy costume had to make a G-string so she could hide her slight bulge. This is called tucking, and it is when a trans woman, before having gender affirming surgery, will tuck her genitals under her body to give a flat appearance. It can, understandably, be rather uncomfortable. At this time, she legally changed her name by deed poll to Caroline Cossey and learned that she could earn more money if she could go topless and decided to have breast augmentation surgery and began saving. Caroline thought she had made a friend with one of the showgirls, Dawn. However, Dawn had a boyfriend who wanted to take photos of her to sell to newspapers that would reveal that Caroline was transgender. She refused point blank. But this incident would foreshadow an event in the early 80s. Caroline would regularly meet Polly for a meal and drinks, and on one occasion she met an Arab prince who took them to a five-star hotel, and before leaving, the prince's father gave her £500 towards her breast op. Now she had enough money and saw her doctor, who recommended a surgeon, and soon she was able to go topless. The next step for her career would be to become a Bluebell girl, and Caroline saw an audition advertised in The Stage, which is the publication covering the performing arts, and had a successful audition with a casting director, Peter, and did not mention she was trans, as why should she? She was a woman. She was told she would be joining the Bluebell Review tour in Spain. Therefore, a passport was needed, which she could apply for in person at Petty France, which was the location of the London Passport Office. As she had not had her surgery, she could only obtain a temporary passport, which she left with Peter. But a few days later, he asked to see her and asked her why she had not told him she was trans. He said the Spanish authorities had queried the passport's restriction and had made inquiries. Caroline never discovered how he found out about her, but joining the Bluebells was off, which was devastating for her. However, Peter gave her a contact in Paris, Helga, who was German and an ex-Bluebell girl, who worked at a Paris club where Caroline might find work. Caroline asked Helga if she should mention she was trans, Helga thought it wouldn't matter, but perhaps not. But if asked, tell them. After a while, Helga took Caroline to a small club and there introduced her to the male head waiter, whom Caroline found very attractive, and was surprised when Helga said they were assigned female at birth. Caroline's reaction to a trans man illustrates just because you're a trans woman does not mean you will necessarily be aware of the diversity of gender identities. Caroline enjoyed being taken out, but these relationships could only go so far. Then she met someone who came from Kuwait and in her autobiography referred to as H, who had a suite in a hotel. After seeing Caroline for a while, he asked her to move in, and so Caroline plucked up the courage to tell him about herself. His response was that he didn't care, as he found her beautiful and loved her, and wanted her to leave the show and come live with him in Kuwait. At first, Caroline said she couldn't, as she was saving for her gender affirming surgery, but the attraction of living in Kuwait changed her mind. It was after 2 or 3 weeks that Caroline learnt that H was married. Caroline lived in a luxury apartment where H visited her at weekends, but being a woman posed restrictions upon where she could go, and even the lack of luxury can pale. And finally, Caroline's need for her surgery decided her to fly home, which H paid for. And for all the luxury of Kuwait, she arrived home with less money than when she left. And it was a male dancer friend at where she worked who came up with a solution, striptease in Europe. As the law meant she would only be allowed to strip down to her G-string, which was perfect. Her friend helped her develop a routine, and after some thought decided to go to Italy, where she met someone, Claudio. However, she kept him at a distance, fearing his reaction if he found out she was trans. Soon she had £2,000, enough money for her operation, and returned to Britain. But after speaking to Polly, decided against Casablanca and made an appointment to see her doctor, who informed her that Casablanca would have been a bad idea and recommended a surgeon in London who had excellent results. However, first she had to see a psychiatrist, as it was only if they felt surgery was in her best interest would they give approval. If you've listened to the third part of my autobiography, a Journey of Transition, Caroline's Story, Part 3, you will know that I also had to have an assessment before my surgery. However, this was with a psychologist. As what is now referred to as gender incongruence has changed from being considered a mental disorder to a psychological condition. Definite progress. Before her operation, she had medical tests. And you remember I said when at junior school she was seen at a hospital for balance issues and they said it may be something hormonal? Well, the pre-operation tests revealed that she had an intersex DSD condition, XXXY syndrome, which is a variant of Klinefelter syndrome. And yes, it can cause balance issues and a more feminine appearance due to significant androgen testosterone deficiency. However, even if discovered when Caroline was young, given it was the 60s, would she have been given the help to realize her true self? Possibly not. Caroline's surgery went well, although, unlike myself, she experienced quite some pain, although her recovery was quicker than mine. And soon she was off to Italy, and now she could experience lovemaking as a woman with Claudio. and her career took another turn. She signed up with an agency working as a glamour model under the name Tula, which rather lovely in Hindu means pure gold, and had an active social life. And in 1978 won a place on a game show 321. However, a tabloid so-called journalist contacted her saying they planned to write about her being transgender. Caroline pulled out of the show, and after was less outgoing, and perhaps thought as nothing about her past had so far materialized that being trans would not be made public. But after being cast as an extra in the Roger Moore James Bond film For Your Eyes Only, that hateful edition of the News of the World appeared in September 1981, shattering her world and her modelling career. Caroline continued modelling and responded to her outing by publishing in 1982 her first autobiography, I Am a Woman. However, it was not until her second autobiography, My Story, published in 1991, that she revealed that she had an intersex DSD condition. Her first relationship after being trans was made public was with Count Glauco Lucina, an Italian advertising executive, and the couple became engaged in 1982. And it was he who encouraged her to challenge the British government denying that she was a woman. They did intend to marry, but could not do so in the UK. However, with the enactment of Law Number 164 on the 14th of April 1982 in Italy, it was possible for a trans person to have their affirmed gender identity recognised and so have a straight marriage. However, if cisgender or transgender and lesbian or gay, even now it is still not possible to marry in Italy. However, by the passing of Law Number 76 of 2016, as of the 5th of June 2016, it was possible to have a same sex civil union. And in fact, the UK led Italy by passing the Civil Partnership Act 2004, which became law on the 5th of December 2005. But back to the 24th of February 1984. Caroline then used the provision of Article 25 of the European Court of Human Rights that permits an individual to bring a claim, and Caroline's was against the UK government for refusing to allow her to change her name and sex on her birth certificate and to marry as a woman. However, her relationship with Glauco could not withstand the continuous, intense, transphobic media pressure, and so in 1985 their engagement ended. Caroline's case was brought under Article 8 that protects intrusion into your private life, your family life, your home, and your correspondence, as a birth certificate, if asked for, would reveal that a person was transgender. So, a violation of a person's right to privacy, surely. And Article 12 that protects the right of men and women of marriageable age to marry and start a family. However, it would be just over 6.5 years before the court delivered its verdict, and the then Conservative government fought tooth and nail against Caroline. So, no change there then. But in the meantime, Caroline would appear in two videos by The Power Station in 1985, Get It On, Bang a Gong, and Some Like It Hot, and continued modelling. Then in May 1989, she married Elias Fatal, who was a British Israeli businessman who knew she was transgender. However, the news of the world would again intrude in her life by once again making public that she was transgender, although, as before, in a somewhat hateful manner. After the publication, Elias went to see his parents, and Caroline never saw him again. And because at this time Caroline was not legally female, her marriage was annulled, which was exactly what happened to April Ashley in 1970. Then, on the 27th of September 1990, the European Court of Human Rights, in the case of Cossey versus the United Kingdom, gave their verdict, which was in favour of the UK government. Under Article 8, the right to privacy, it was 10 votes to 8 against Caroline's case, and under Article 12, the right to marry, it was 14 votes to 4 against. However, although Caroline lost the case, it should be seen in the context of an earlier case that also challenged the UK government under Articles 8 and 12, brought by Mark Rees, a trans man. In that earlier case of Rees versus the United Kingdom, which was ruled on the 17th of October 1986, the margin was greater against him. Under Article 8, it was 12 to 3 votes, and under Article 12, it was unanimously against him. Therefore, we can see that there was progress by the time of Caroline's case. A year later, Caroline would be the first trans woman to appear in the September 1991 issue of Playboy. Caroline would marry for a second time in August 1992 to David Finch, which she was able to do as the marriage took place in the more enlightened Canada. Caroline, along with others, continued to advocate for trans rights, and finally, under a Labour government, the Gender Recognition Act 2004 became law on the 4th of April 2005. This enabled having a passport with your correct sex marker if trans, something I recently did, although then, as now, there is no X gender neutral option. However, in the USA, this was an option until the second presidency of, do you want to guess who? However, to change your sex marker on your birth certificate and with Revenue and Customs, and to marry, you need a gender recognition certificate, which was also provided under the Act. Initially, this was £140, but now costs just £6, although it does entail some hoop gymnastics and also paying for a statutory declaration. However, there was an anachronism. If a trans person had married before they came out as trans, then they had to divorce from their partner before being granted a gender recognition certificate, as their marriage would then be considered a same-sex marriage, which in 2005 was not permitted. I know, crazy or what? However, with the passing of the Marriage Same-Sex Couples Act 2013, whether transgender or cisgender, lesbian and gay couples could now marry. And one last thought about the Gender Recognition Act 2004. Would today's Labour Party, given that they practically popped champagne corks when the Supreme Court gave their ruling in April 2025, enact such legislation? Well, I wouldn't hold my breath. Then, in 2019, Christopher Anino directed a video to the song Let Me Live by Queen, which featured videos of Queen interspersed and contrasted with images of love and support for Caroline and her hateful press harassment. However, 4 years before the Let Me Live video in July 2015, Caroline set up her Facebook account at Caroline Cossey to continue her trans rights advocacy, such as challenging, as I did in episode 4, that Supreme Court ruling. The fight for trans rights continues, and Caroline, I'm happy to say, is still happily married. At the end of the last episode, celebrating gender diversity in song part 2, I mentioned I had received my first question, and in the same week I received my second. Perhaps you could make it a third. And to read my answers, check out the Have Your Say page of the website supporting the podcast at www.twts.co.uk. Also, I would love this podcast to be interactive, where you, dear listeners, can contribute, perhaps suggesting topics or raise concerns that could perhaps be explored in future episodes. This episode was written and presented by me, Caroline O'Reilly. Thank you for listening. Next time, transition, social, legal, medical.